Film director Michael McClure of The 10,000 Day War once stated that the Ho Chi Minh Trail was developed under ancient conditions, like in the 12th century BC, but the battles on the trail utilized advanced techniques, heralding the 21st century. This comment can show us the correlation of forces between the US and Vietnam on the legendary Ho Chi Minh Trail back then. As we learned in the previous episode, the AC-130 planes back then were able to use infrared night vision devices, amplifying dim light up to 4,000 times, detecting electrical sparks when a car operates. Thus, wherever there was a moving car, the US could know and have its soldiers attack those vehicles, supplying the South's battlefield. The question for Vietnam now is how to escape from this terrifying weapon dubbed the Spectre, with the principle that no matter how modern a device is, it must have a weakness. So at all costs, Vietnam had to find its limitation. The AC-130's drawback is its large and cumbersome size, slow flying speed, usually flying at an altitude below 3 km, which made it afraid to fly during the day for fear of being shot down. This inadvertently made the task of supplying the South Vietnamese battlefield somewhat easier for the Vietnamese troops. If Vietnam's night transportation was fiercely attacked by the US, then they could run during the day when the US could do nothing. Not to mention, running at night, Vietnam could only move at about 20 kilometers per hour due to darkness and dust. Now, moving during the day could achieve speeds of 30 to 40 kilometers per hour, doubling the productivity, as it would be easier to travel by day anyway. However, the problem with moving during the day for show is that they also didn't dare to move in the midday sun because US reconnaissance planes were very sensitive back then. Reconnaissance planes like the U-2 would buzz overhead all day. Once a target was spotted, they would drop smoke bombs to call in other planes to bomb. Knowing the AC-130 fly slow and slow for reconnaissance, but using cannons to shoot it down was extremely difficult. Not to mention, if you decide to shoot it down, the first shot must hit immediately. If the first shot doesn't hit, Vietnam would expose all its positions. So, how to move during the day without being detected by reconnaissance planes? The Vietnamese engineers came up with the method of creating secret roads and covering them with layers of forest foliage overhead for vehicles to travel below. Now, they could only be called early morning or late afternoon runs, around 5 a.m. or 5 p.m., taking advantage of some sunlight, as those were times when reconnaissance planes no longer operated, and the AC-130 did not dare to appear. Yet, American generals were not novices in tactics, so the question posed for Vietnam now was how to not expose these secret routes, still supply goods to the south without being seen transporting at night. Then, when and how should they transport? Not going at night meant Vietnam had to move during the day. Thus, they had to use deception to fool the US. At night, they would still have to turn on the lights bright, running on open roads that Vietnam wanted the US to know, to attract enemy bombing. Not only that, but they also dug tunnels and placed explosives inside, which when operated would create electrical sparks just like in a car, making the US believe that they were still operating within their control and bomb away. Any damaged vehicle or goods were pulled into the road to be burned, making the US think it was destroying many of our targets. Even more, Vietnamese troops had to deploy anti-aircraft guns to protect the route, to make the US certain that this was Vietnam's lifeline. So Vietnamese troops were doing everything to keep it. However, all of that was just a deception tactic that the US could never have imagined from the Vietnamese troops. They deceived so well that the reconnaissance planes detected the foliage-covered routes, thinking it was done for night operations only, not for daytime use. The US even laughed that they had developed weapons to detect targets through infrared and electrical sparks from internal combustion engines, so no matter how much it was covered with dense foliage, it couldn't escape. Thus, the US left those tree canopies for Vietnam to do whatever they wanted, thinking that all these efforts were futile and time-consuming. However, in the end, the US realized Vietnam had shifted from night-to-day operations to supply the South, and inevitably, day-fighting aircraft without modern electronic equipment, like at night, had to bring the AC-130 out during the day to detect and attack Vietnamese targets. However, the issue was, Vietnam only feared the AC-130 in the darkness. In the light, it was nothing more than a clunky piece of metal with wings, because it was heavy, slow, and couldn't fly too high. and Vietnamese cannons could shoot it down anyway. Moreover, during the twilight and dusk, US reconnaissance planes couldn't see where the Vietnamese cannons were to drop smoke bombs for coordination, and this was the pinnacle of Vietnamese military art. No matter how modern and powerful the US was, the peak of military strategy still made the enemy fight according to Vietnam's will. After shooting down two AC-130 planes on March 29th and 30, 1972, the US had to remove the AC-130 from the strategic supply line, and then in 1973 had to completely withdraw, realizing that they could no longer compete with the Vietnamese troops. So the question is why, after bombing Vietnam for years, did they not know about the secret routes that were still being used for transportation? How did Vietnam hide them so well that the US couldn't detect? Then, after the liberation of the South, Lieutenant General Jong Sin Nguyen saw a map of the Ho Chi Minh Trail at the headquarters of the Saigon Army and smiled. It turns out, for over 15 years, they knew of its existence, but it was just for fun, as it had no effect on military tactics. How did the Vietnamese troops hide those secret routes? The answer will be in episode 4. And with that, today's history discussion program must come to an end. Thank you all for your interest and attention, and remember to subscribe to the Legends of History channel.